Welcome to episode 7 of Let's Rage Together, a podcast where two friends talk about the politics of total liberation and related topics.
We annihilated the world before your very ears.
You can't handle the truth.
Hey everyone, welcome to the 7th episode of Let's Rage Together podcast. I'm Pete,
And I'm Taryn.
and on today's episode we are doing part 2 of our discussion on defining veganism. In this episode we'll be talking about whether the definition of veganism should be made stricter or more narrow, and I think the conversation is pretty interesting and I hope you're going to get something out of it.
But before we get started, we just want to say a huge thank you to Cachet for being our latest Patreon supporter. Thanks so much, Cachet.
Thanks, Cachet.
And if you would also like to support us in any way, then you can head over to our website, letsragetogether.co.za, where there's all the information about Patreon and PayPal if you want to become a Patreon supporter or give us a once-off PayPal donation. Otherwise, if you could rate and review us on iTunes, that would be a huge help, or just share our posts and episodes with people you think might find them interesting.
Yeah, so before we jump into the main discussion, we're going to do our section called The Bad and the Rad, where we talk about topics that maybe don't warrant a full episode. So thanks for listening, and I guess here we go.
It's time for the bad and the rad.
So in this episode, we decided to discuss a maybe. It's something we've been seeing pop up quite a lot recently, and we're not really sure if it's a bad or a rad, but we think it warrants some discussion, particularly in the context of defining veganism. So Pete, maybe you can just explain how the Liberation Pledge works.
So some of you might have seen posts going around with hashtag Liberation Pledge, or people talking about the Liberation Pledge with like a fork wrapped around their wrist. Basically what the Liberation Pledge is, according to their website, is a pledge you can take, and it says pledge to live vegan and to refuse to sit where animals' bodies are being eaten. It says the pledge is simple. 1. Publicly refuse to eat animals, live vegan. Cool. 2. Publicly refuse to sit where animals are being eaten. And 3. Encourage others to take the pledge. Wear a fork bracelet as a symbol of this pledge and to show support for others who have taken it as well. Just background of the fork, where it comes from is bending a fork into a symbol of non-violence. We reclaim a tool that is indirectly the single tool most responsible for the immense suffering and unimaginable deaths animals endure. The reason why the people who set it up thought it was important is because they say it's to show this truth to the world. However, we have to make a public stand and create social norms around the idea that animals are not ours to eat. Refusing to sit where the bodies of animals lie and publicly displaying your commitment with a fork bracelet is a powerful way to do this. Then they use what I think is an extremely weird analogy, but just to read it before we discuss it. They say the historical campaign against foot binding in China struggled for 1,000 years. Education, lobbying, and countless other methods made no traction in stopping what was, like eating animals today, considered a traditional practice. But in 1890, campaigners found a magic bullet. They created a public pledge where families could group together and promise to 1. Never bind their daughters' feet, and 2. To refuse to allow their sons to marry women with bound feet. These pledges, while initially difficult, grew like wildfire, and after 1,000 years of suffering, completely ended the practice of foot binding. We can do the same for animals by refusing to participate in violent practices, but also refusing to accept violent practices in our community. So those are the things that I took from the website that I thought are kind of relevant to the discussion about it. And hopefully you have a better idea now of what the Liberation Pledge is. What are your opinions on this Liberation Pledge, T?
I think there are some good elements to it, and I think there are some very problematic elements. Obviously, we believe in being and living vegan, so that's not really up for debate in terms of the pledge. But I think we can discuss the kind of nuances of whether or not it's a beneficial pledge or not. But just from the things that stick out immediately as being weird and problematic for me, firstly, the fork bracelet and the kind of symbolism of the fork, it screams cult.
Yeah.
From an outsider's perspective, like, why are you wearing this specific bracelet and it's a fork and it's like very obvious? And I kind of get that it's a symbol to kind of show that you're part of the pledge, but other than that, I don't really understand it. I have seen that they also use those like rubber bracelets with a printed fork on.
Yeah.
So I guess that's a little bit less obvious, but
What do you think about the fact that they said it's the single most used?
I think the assumption that the fork is the tool that's responsible for the most suffering and death is probably just inaccurate. When people are eating animal flesh, they're more likely to need a knife than when you're eating vegetables. You generally don't need to cut a lot of vegetables as much as animal flesh. And then when we look at the actual killing of animals, the majority of them are killed by the blade of a knife, not a fork. So that in itself is just annoyingly inaccurate. What do you think about the symbolism of the fork?
I agree with what you're saying about the fork. I don't think I have anything really to add to that, but I do think that your point is really good to make on it coming across cult-like. And I think anything like this, pledges, fasts, whatever, I'm always a bit careful of, because they do come across to people as culty or like religious, you know?
Yeah.
That is problematic because veganism is already seen as something that's kind of extreme and dogmatic, and that's something that we need to break, not reinforce, you know?
Yeah. Just a quick side note, completely unrelated to the episode. If there are any annoyingly strange sounds happening, we apologize, but my rad little dog Josie is being impossible right now and just wants to play, so there might be some little paw prints running around. Paw prints running? Can paw prints run?
Paw sounds.
Paw steps.
Paw steps.
Yes.
But Josie's rad, so just deal with it.
Back to the topic at hand. What do you think about the analogy with the campaign in China against foot binding?
So I think it's just a really weird analogy to use. Like, out of everything that you could have chosen in history, why did you choose like Chinese foot binding? I think it's like a massive leap to make analogy-wise from that to like the exploitation of non-human animals.
Yeah, I mean, the only parallel I can see is literally traditional practice and public pledge. That's
Yes.
as far as it goes. But even the fact that they say nothing worked in that campaign except this public pledge, there's no evidence to say that because it worked in that situation, it's going to work in this situation. There's so many different elements at play
Yeah.
that you can't just assume it's going to work.
Yeah, I think it's really strange. I mean, mentioning that families pledge not to let their sons marry daughters who had their feet bound is strange as well, because most likely the daughters didn't have a choice in that. If you're bringing marriage into it, it's just a weird analogy to use for this.
So on the pledge itself, do you think it could be beneficial in terms of the avoidance of sitting at a table where animal products are being consumed?
I'm not sure, to be honest, because when I first read about the pledge, I think it was a post where some person had flown on a plane and then asked to be moved because they were sitting next to someone who was eating animals. And immediately I thought of, firstly, that you are removing yourself from the possibility of someone seeing, oh, you vegan, and then asking you questions about it. Then, for example, in my travels, and I've traveled quite a lot, it's something that I would struggle with because I've been offered food by many people. Not that I would eat animal-based foods. That's where I think everyone kind of has ethical lines that they won't cross, regardless of whatever culture you're visiting. And for me, that's veganism. So anyone can offer me anything, and I will respectfully decline if it contains any animal products. But if they are eating animal products and offer me food that I can eat, I don't see how it's beneficial to anyone for me to say, I can't sit with you and eat, when they're offering me their hospitality, and maybe there's a connection that can be had, and maybe they won't be open to veganism straight away, but over time, possibly. The other thing that I thought of is with children, because they don't exactly have a choice. Their parents are deciding for them what they are eating. And I've had it before quite a few times when I've been sitting next to a child, either someone related to me or someone else's child, who is consuming animal products, and they are interested in me. And I don't think that veganism should be so self-focused that I cut myself off from possible communication with other people just because I'm sensitive to the fact that they are eating animal products.
Yeah,
Actually, not even just animal products, but animal flesh only.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up as well, that it doesn't explicitly say animal products. It says where animals are being eaten, which kind of implies just flesh, which to me is a problem, because then does that mean if people are having tea and cake and you can't see the animal flesh, but there's egg and dairy and all sorts of things, is that okay? I find that quite ambiguous. And I also agree with you that it can be quite divisive then, and it does close off any opportunity for debate and conversation. And like you say, especially with kids, they are still learning about a lot of things. They don't have as many choices in terms of what they eat and what they do. So you could be a really good influence in that kid's life. And instead, if you just remove yourself from the situation, they won't ever have that influence, possibly. So I do agree that it can definitely be harmful in that sense.
Yeah, I think in some of those situations, some people already have the idea that vegans are self-righteous or think of themselves as like elite.
Yeah.
And that to me is just going to feed into that idea when you really are just like any other person.
That said, though, I do think that it does have benefits in the sense that if I think back to the last time I was at a table across from someone eating flesh, I felt sick to my stomach, especially when they start making comments like, oh, this lamb is really tasty. I don't want to hear that shit,
I can relate to that.
And as much as it's not about me, you're sitting across from people eating corpses. Like, we shouldn't have to do that. In the same way that you wouldn't sit at a table with someone making sexist jokes or racist jokes, you shouldn't have to sit across from animal exploitation, because that's, in a sense, if you're not saying anything or you are allowing that to occur, it's acquiescence. You're allowing it to happen and essentially being complicit. In a way.
I understand that, but also you don't know beforehand if your uncle is going to make a racist remark. So you can't be like, I'm not going to sit with the racist.
Yeah, it's not like you're sitting down to be racist.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas like
versus sitting down to eat flesh.
Yeah, and you know, and what can happen as well is even in that situation, you don't necessarily have to leave. They could say something problematic that's racist. You could challenge them. And then it could turn into a very constructive debate where they see your point of view and then you keep sitting there and having the conversation in the meal.
But doesn't that imply that it is problematic then to sit down when the intention is to eat flesh? Because as much as you just said you can't anticipate your uncle making a racist joke, so you're just sitting there. If the opportunity arises to educate him if he's made a racist joke or a racist comment, cool, you can call him out. You know when you sit down to a meal that people are going to be eating flesh. That is like then sitting down to a racist debate.
Except that racism already is a public social taboo, whereas eating animals is normal.
That's true.
So in that way, you cannot expect people to inherently realize it's wrong, although they should, to eat animals.
But what about the times where it was normal to be racist? Like in apartheid South Africa. Should you then be like, oh, well, I can't challenge this right now because, you know, we're living in apartheid, so, oh, well, let's sit down and be racist.
I guess what I'm thinking about is that even in those situations, you should still allow the chance for conversation before you cut yourself off. Whereas, like, the Liberation Pledge, it's maybe people you've never met who you won't meet because you say, I'm not going to sit with you. So you aren't even there to defend animals or like bring up any kind of discussion.
Yeah, there's no like vegan presence there then.
Yeah.
So I agree with you on that. But I do think there's benefit. If you look at how the pledge is done, they give templates for like letters to send out to your family or posts to make or whatever to explain why you're doing it. I really do like the idea of explaining to your family that you don't want to sit across the table from this exploitation and why. And explaining that you can still spend time together over a vegan meal or something that's not food related. There's a lot of benefit to that, I think. And I've found that I've naturally started doing that with some of my family, where I'll say, yes, I'll come to the social gathering, but if you're going to be having a braai or whatever, I'll come a bit later, or I'm not going to stand there while you're cooking, or I'm going to eat somewhere else. And it's kind of just been a natural progression where a lot of my family now knows, well, luckily a lot of my immediate family is vegan now, but the non-vegan ones are kind of purposefully keeping the animal products away from me. And there is that opportunity for debate without me having to sit at a table and look at that. again, it's not about me, but it is creating awareness. And I think maybe finding a balance like that is a good option. But I agree with you in situations where you don't have control over or you don't know who's going to be there. So the first thing that popped into my mind was going to a friend's birthday gathering. It's not all mutual friends. You don't know everyone that's going to be there. It happens to be a dinner at a restaurant. Are you going to just not go to that birthday gathering or say, okay, I'll come after the food? Because sometimes you don't know when people are going to be eating. There's no way you can kind of plan around that without being a total social inconvenience.
Yeah.
There, I think it's not beneficial because instead of just being there, maybe trying to seat yourself on the corner of a table where you're not around too much of that, but in a situation where people can see you order a vegan meal, ask you about it, you can have a discussion and hopefully educate, put your own reservations aside for a second to educate. I think that's more beneficial than just saying I'm not coming to your birthday.
I totally agree. But I also agree with how you said it can be beneficial. And I feel like non-vegans are way too attached and sensitive to the type of food they're eating. Because you don't have to be vegan to eat vegan food. It's just food. So in that way, I feel that you should be able to say, I don't really want to see a dead baby sheep that's been cooked on your plates. So out of respect for me, just like I think that they would show respect if someone was Jewish or Islamic and not eat pork or something, that they would just decide to eat different food.
Yeah.
They don't have to be vegan or share your ethics at all, but just for the one meal, I don't get why they couldn't.
Yeah.
And especially if it's something like your birthday or something that you have some control over, I don't think that it's necessarily putting anyone out of anything to make sure that the food is all going to be vegan. And I do think that if, for example, you asked a friend or someone who wanted to meet up to go out, that you could request that where you go is either a vegan restaurant, or if they're with you, that they order the vegan option as well.
Yeah.
I don't think that is necessarily a problematic thing. I think where it comes in as problematic for me is that it's a pledge. So it's kind of like, to me, I think you're kind of setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah.
And also possibly to isolate yourself, because what if you don't have any vegan friends?
And what if the friends and family that you do have are very uncompromising, conservative, whatever? It's easy for us to say, cool, let's request a vegan restaurant. Generally, the non-vegan people in our lives are going to be okay with that. But some people don't have anyone who's even open to it remotely and will just say no. So I feel like that could also affect mental health, especially if you're already an activist. Being vegan already is quite a strain sometimes in terms of dealing with the same questions over and over, dealing with those debates. For some people, the pledge might work. Again, similar to your sentiments, I do have a problem with the fact that it's such a strict pledge. But for some people, it could really affect their mental health because it can socially isolate them. It can kind of lead to situations, even in some cultures, dangerous situations where that person could be threatened in terms of not having a place to stay if their family disowns them for disrespecting their cultural traditions or whatever it may be. But I think we can't assume from our situations that it's easy to take this pledge or something similar.
Yeah. And I mean, what are you going to do if you went out with your gran or something and she got a scone and tea?
Yeah.
Are you going to tell her beforehand, please don't eat anything that's not vegan, if she doesn't have any idea what veganism is? Because obviously it's just talking about flesh, but like you said, that's kind of arbitrary because it's just one animal product and it's just obvious that you can see it's from an animal. But are you going to not have tea with your gran? Because it's super important, as well as being vegan and staying true to your ethics, to also maintain friend and family relationships and to not strain them, especially for people who struggle with mental health issues and who feel isolated.
And again, if we go back to other social justice issues, I mean, we can't be apologetic about it and say, oh, well, we don't want to offend anyone or push people away, because you wouldn't compromise like that with other issues. If someone is being overtly problematic, you deal with it. But it's so difficult because veganism is so centered around food in a lot of situations, and food is so central to family and culture and a lot of those things. So it becomes a lot more tricky than just other kinds of problematic behaviors. So I think we have to be mindful of that as well. And, you know, speaking about the example, like going to tea with your gran, I've had that situation where I've actually taken my gran out for her birthday. And we went to a place where there were vegan options. Of course, I ordered the vegan option, encouraged her to try some, but she would not order something vegan. She just will not if we go out. And that's okay because she's probably never going to change now.
Yeah.
But having been around me eating a lot of vegan food, she now eats a lot of vegan food at home. She will try vegan food at family gatherings and she will enjoy it. Previously, she wouldn't. That's a pretty huge step for someone in their 80s. Not to be ageist and assume that older people can't change, but, it's not really as likely.
Yeah.
So I think in those situations, it's better to just like kind of grin and bear it and be like, hey, well, it's your birthday. Order what you want, but, still have that opportunity for discussion and being exposed to veganism at least.
Yeah, and you don't always need to speak about veganism either.
Yeah.
Just have some tea with your gran and chill.
Yeah, and show her that whatever you ordered is also really delicious looking.
Yeah. I just don't really see why it needs to be a pledge that you sign up for versus a sentiment that you could kind of integrate into your own veganism.
Yeah.
Because, I agree. It would be a cool thing to try as far as is possible and practicable, like veganism, to say, I'm going to try not to be around when people are eating animals. But I just have an issue with it being a pledge.
Yeah, I think, like you said earlier, you're setting yourself up for failure and creating situations that are going to cause issues. So you mentioned earlier as well that it is quite self-focused, which I agree with, that it's very much about you and how you feel and how you're perceiving the situation. And I think it can detract a little bit away from the animals, especially because it's just animal flesh. So aside from it not including other animal products, it's also very food-focused.
Very. Animals are exploited in so many ways. And food is probably the main way that the majority of animals are being exploited. But what about people wearing leather? Should we also not sit next to people wearing leather or buy anything from like a supermarket that sells animal products at all?
Yeah.
Why specifically the pledge to not be around when someone's just eating meat instead of making it a bigger kind of thing? I still think that we live in a non-vegan world, and so it's important to exist and function within the non-vegan world where exploiting animals is the norm. And so it's great to be in our vegan bubbles and around people, if you're lucky enough, who are vegan and have your circles and everything. But outside of that, you sometimes just need to suck it up and just live in the world and be a good example and educate people where you can and realize that you cannot change everyone. But I just personally think the negatives outweigh the positives for me about the Liberation Pledge.
Yeah. I mean, I get where the emphasis is on food. I'm just thinking about this now, in that it is active participation. If someone's wearing a watch with a leather strap and you don't want to sit with them, that's kind of arbitrary because they might have bought it 5 years ago and you're like, I'm not going to sit with you because you're wearing that.
Very good point.
It's going to be very hard for them to make that connection. But when they are actively participating and sitting down to actively participate in that exploitation and are probably centering the whole gathering around eating that flesh, I understand that should be an emphasis because it's like, I'm not going to sit with you because you're choosing to do this right now in a very active way. But I agree with you that overall the harms probably outweigh the benefits, although I think the benefits are important. I think the concept of the pledge is really good in terms of being less apologetic in these situations.
I agree.
And making spaces where you are making it obvious in a very calm, rational way that this is not okay. You don't have to sit around this. And I think that's great. But I agree with you that the pledge itself, I mean, I don't think it should be integrated into the definition of veganism. Like if you're vegan, you can't sit where non-vegans are eating non-vegan stuff.
Yeah, you are still vegan if you eat next to non-vegans.
Yeah. If you're doing the pledge and you're hearing this, let us know how it's going. Let us know if we're right about some of the kind of downfalls of it, or maybe you've had a different experience. I'd like to hear from people who have actually tried to implement it.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that as well. I just think that it is important to realize that eating animals is, like I said, the norm. And a lot of people don't see what they're doing as active exploitation, even though it is. And from my personal experience, so I guess it's anecdotal evidence, a lot of people have been around who have overheard things I've said or saw that I was eating vegan food. And I was eating food around people eating non-vegan food who would ask me later about veganism.
Yeah.
Which would have never happened if I hadn't been there.
Yeah, exactly. I think we can't forget the missed opportunities of not being there at all. So the pledge is an example of making veganism more strict, possibly. And there are a lot of other areas where people think that the definition of veganism should be made more narrow, and it should be kind of a step further than what it is now in terms of how you should behave or the things you should avoid in order to consider yourself vegan. And a huge one in this regard is palm oil.
It comes up constantly in all of the vegan groups. Oh, hey, check out this nice pie I had. Hey, that has palm oil. It's not vegan.
Yeah.
So, I mean, sometimes the vegan groups are kind of embarrassing, actually.
Yeah, the South African ones at least.
With the amount of stuff, like sugar's not vegan, palm oil is not vegan, everything is not vegan.
That's so bad for your health. You're not vegan.
Yeah, exactly.
So, do you think palm oil is vegan, Pete? In a nutshell?
In a nutshell, yes.
I agree.
Palm oil is oil from a plant.
Yeah.
So, technically, it is vegan. Yes, the industry is exploitative, just like every other capitalist industry is exploitative.
Yeah, but it is still vegan.
Still vegan.
And I can almost hear people typing furious emails to us right now telling us we're not vegan. But hear us out. So palm oil is vegan as a product. It is a vegan product. But like you say, it's exploitative just like every other industry you can probably think of. But my original kind of criticism of the palm oil outrage has always been, cool, I agree. It causes massive devastation. It's destroying rainforests. It's destroying habitats, wiping out animals at an alarming rate. Well, I have two critiques. My first one is how many people, especially non-vegans, would be as outraged about palm oil if they were not seeing orangutans die?
Yeah.
I feel like because it's primates, everyone loses their shit, and there are so many other species going extinct from all other kinds of agriculture. Not to mention the fact that animal agriculture is a massive contributor to deforestation, much, much more than palm oil. But this intense focus on palm oil, especially from non-vegans, doesn't make sense to me when animal agriculture causes much more harm. And if there were no primates involved, most of those people, I guarantee, would not bat an eye.
I agree. And vegans even. Because, any monoculture crop industrially harvested is killing hundreds of, or thousands, I don't know what the stats are, but of mice and rodents and all of those animals. Why do they matter less than orangutans?
Exactly. I think it's super speciesist and it's terrible. I've almost been in tears looking at some of the articles, but I really do think that it's a speciesist backing that is like driving the outrage. Yes, there would still be people who, from an environmental perspective, care about the rainforest, but the animal concern is, I find, hugely inflated because of primates. My second initial critique of the palm oil outrage. I agree it's terrible. I agree if you can avoid palm oil, you probably should. But what is the alternative? To me, the problem is not palm oil. It's the way the palm oil is being harvested and also the amount of overconsumption in the world.
Yeah.
Basically, capitalism at its finest. Think of what products use palm oil. Margarines, chips, chocolates, all of the junk that you don't actually need. The problem is not the oil itself. The problem is that we are consuming so much shit we don't need that we need to produce such a massive amount of this oil. If we say, okay, palm oil is bad because it's destroying the rainforest, what is the alternative? I looked at a couple of comparisons of yield of different kinds of oils, and palm oil has the biggest yield. So it's the most efficient, which means if we just suddenly switch to things like coconut oil or sunflower oil or whatever it might be, we're probably going to use a lot more land. And anyone can correct me if I'm wrong here, but this is what it seems to be. Surely palm oil is being used because it's efficient. So if we switch, the demand is still there. So we have to somehow find other land. It might not be in a rainforest, but it might destroy some other habitat. So then we're in a situation where the devastation is much, much bigger, but maybe not towards primates. So I don't know. I just feel like it's an not empty, but it's like quite a problematic concern when you're not looking at the bigger picture of overconsumption.
So I won't correct you, but rather reinforce what you're saying. An article that we will link to in the show notes called What's Worse Than Palm Oil for the Environment, Other Vegetable Oils. So they say in this article that existing vegetable oils that could theoretically replace palm oil would be far more damaging to the environment because they would need more land. The IUCN basically issued a report titled Palm Oil and Biodiversity. And Like you said, the production of palm oil is characterized by its high yield relative to other vegetable oils, meaning that more of it can be produced from a given area of farmland than other oil crops. So the latter require up to 9 times more land than oil palms to produce the same amount of oil. So it's a massive amount of land that they would have to use if we were to switch palm oil with another oil potentially.
Yeah, so I personally think that, palm oil's shit, but overconsumption is the main issue. Instead of saying, oh, I'm going to switch from buying this packet of chips or chocolate or whatever because it has palm oil to this other junk food, maybe just eat less junk that has oil. Because if it's not palm oil, it's going to be something else.
Yeah, and we're not saying don't care about palm oil or that the current palm oil outrage is not an issue, but really people need to get some perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally justified. The outrage is justified. The concern is justified. I admire the efforts of the people trying to look for alternatives and trying to encourage palm oil-free products. And I should probably do better at that. But you cannot say palm oil is not vegan, because then you have to say plastic is not vegan. And you have to say that pretty much everything we contribute to ever is not vegan because harm is being caused. You can't just assume palm oil is the worst because it's the rainforest and because it's orangutans. Yes, the rate is alarming and devastating, but so are other things. So if we say palm oil is not vegan, can we say that coffee and chocolate are vegan?
Well, exactly. Or could you say that soy products aren't vegan because soy is typically a monoculture crop and monoculture crops are shit?
Exactly.
So you're going to just get yourself into this spiral where nothing is vegan.
And if we're being super strict about veganism, then we should be including humans. So then we have to look at the slavery involved in like chocolate and coffee.
Yeah. But speaking of chocolate and coffee, some people also include that. What do you think, like, as a vegan, with your definition being not exploiting animals, both human and non-human, do you think that it's possible to consume coffee and chocolate that isn't fair trade certified and be vegan?
Again, I think it's a similar kind of issue as palm oil and a whole other range of issues. Coffee and chocolate are vegan. If you are vegan or ethical in any sense of the word, you should think about these things and think about your impact, the impact of your choices. So use like the Food Empowerment Project list and buy ethical and fair trade and whatever products if you can. But it is still vegan. If it contains no animal products, it's vegan.
You mentioned the Food Empowerment Project, and they're an amazing organization that we will link to in the show notes that you should check out. But they released this chocolate list where basically they say a chocolate is recommended or not recommended or hasn't responded. And it's a way to be more conscious of that because typically they're using child and slave labor for the cocoa beans, especially if it comes from West Africa. So you can download this app and use it on your phone. But even Food Empowerment Project acknowledges that chocolate is vegan because their tagline is just because it's vegan doesn't mean it's cruelty-free.
Exactly.
So personally, I love that line. Like, I think that's a great way to frame your veganism. Veganism by itself doesn't make it cruelty-free, but chocolate is still vegan. Palm oil is still vegan.
Yeah. Also, what we discussed last episode, I think we highlighted pretty well that veganism is not perfect, and that's okay. But we shouldn't try to make it less perfect because we're lazy or we selfish or whatever. But by the same token, we shouldn't try and make it too perfect because it's never going to be. If we take all of these ideas to their logical conclusions, like palm oil isn't vegan, then, for example, plastic cannot be vegan. Even the production of plastic products, there's this whole chain of events that is just problematic at every step of the way that we could not possibly call that vegan if we are saying palm oil is not vegan.
I totally agree. And I think it ties into having the politics of animal liberation.
Yeah.
And veganism is not this like saving you from all cruelty kind of thing. It's just part of being an ethical human being. And it's the same reason why my political stance of veganism also got me to having other politics, being anti-fascist, being anti-capitalist, being interested in anarchism and ideas like that. So I feel like there's no point of attaching all of these things onto the definition of veganism, because then what's the point of veganism? You should just be the most ethical human possible.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we should be striving to be more and more ethical as far as possible, but I don't think we need to lump everything onto veganism.
Exactly.
It should be a logical progression, but it shouldn't be this like goalpost to start at
Yeah.
You know, where you're telling new vegans, oh, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. And then before you know it, their head explodes and then you have no vegans.
Exactly.
So you mentioned a little while ago that someone had said to you that they don't regard Coca-Cola products as vegan. What do you think about that?
I think that's your points you've made on our last 2 points ring true as well. Coca-Cola as a product is vegan, but it's the overconsumption, the globalization, the land ownership, everything that Coke is involved with that is problematic. So capitalism is the problem here.
Yeah, and so many of these big corporations own other companies that it's such a weird, complex web of interrelation that you can't even follow what company is owned by what company. So to say that you don't support like one of the big corporations means you probably can't support a whole list of others that you don't even know about. So I feel like it's something you won't be able to wrap your head around consistently.
Yeah, and I try personally to not buy Coca-Cola products because they have really exploited humans. They've fucked up the environment in a lot of ways. But you couldn't tell someone who's drinking a Coca-Cola that they are not vegan. You know, that's why I say like veganism is one political stance to have in your general liberation politics.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
So I think when you look at all of the things we've just spoken about, to me, it's pretty glaringly obvious that the problem is capitalism and not whether it's vegan or not.
Yeah.
And so it's again a thing, you don't need to be anti-capitalist to be vegan. It's not included. I am, because it's part of the politics for me of not exploiting humans and non-humans, because to me, capitalism is an inherently exploitative system.
Yeah.
But palm oil is still vegan, Coke is still vegan. You know, people are on different stages of trying to be more ethical human beings. But one last point we wanted to raise is whether you have to be an activist to consider yourself vegan, because recently one of the animal liberation founders, I think, T will expand on this just now, said you need to be an activist to be a vegan. I'm not sure if that's a constructive way to think about it. What do you think, T?
So there's an article on plant-based news that we'll link in the show notes. It's from August last year. But basically what one of the ALF founders, Ronnie Lee, and a campaigner, Tony Harris, at the Vegan Campout had spoken about expanding the definition of veganism. They say that part of that definition should include a moral duty to educate others. So they looked at the current definition and then they said that their proposed new definition would be that veganism is a way of living that seeks to exclude all forms of exploitation of non-human animals, which extends beyond dietary considerations to the avoidance of all forms of animal abuse, including harm to their natural habitats. It includes a moral duty to actively oppose all forms of animal exploitation and to encourage and educate others to become vegan, with the core aim being the eradication of speciesism. So the first thing I pick up there is that they have now explicitly said non-human animals. So in that way, they've kind of narrowed the definition, whereas it just says animals in the original definition.
Which could include humans and non-humans.
Yes. I think the original definition implies non-human animals, but it could be ambiguous, whereas now they're making it very clear that it's about non-human animals. They also then say it includes harm to their natural habitats. So here we are again bringing in issues like palm oil. If it's destroying natural habitats, then they're basically saying that's not vegan. But again, plastic, all of those things.
Driving a car, everything.
Yeah.
Being a consuming organism on the earth.
Yeah, oh, you're alive, you're not vegan. Okay.
Yeah.
So I find that is a little bit too restrictive. But then they go on to say it includes the moral duty to actively oppose this exploitation and also educate. What do you think about that? In terms of the actual definition of veganism, should it be inherent in veganism that you have to do activism?
I think that it's a should, that if you are vegan and you have the ability to be active, then you should be, but it's not something that would make you not vegan if you weren't.
I agree.
And when I say ability, I mean, that also makes me think about that possibly it's ableist. People who have severe depression and struggle to even get out of bed in the morning, how can you tell them that they aren't vegan because they aren't being activists?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I do think that, you know, the ableism comment could be worked around in the sense that there are different kinds of activism. and different kinds of people can find activism that works for them. Blogging about depression, for example, with a vegan undertone could be considered activism. That's if the person even has energy to do that. But there are other ways to be active. So I think that could be worked around. But I do think there's a risk of ableism for sure. And I don't think someone with mental health issues, for example, should be guilted if they don't feel up to doing activism. But then there's also the argument that some people say, well, just being vegan is activism. That I disagree with. I don't know what you think about that.
I would also disagree with that. It's a very passive way of being an activist. You could say that as long as like anyone knows that you have some kind of stance on any social justice issue,
then
you are an activist.
Yeah.
I think that's a very watered down passive thing, and I don't think that you could make that word that weak.
Yeah. In a sense, I can understand where people are coming from in that just being vegan in a non-vegan world makes people think. But even the word activist says part of it is active. You are actively trying to make a change. And I think just by being vegan, you're not necessarily looking for conversation. You're not necessarily trying to influence people. It's kind of a happy coincidence if you do just by being vegan. It's a different story if you're trying to make really cool recipes and share that on social media or something like that. That is activism to me, because that is encouraging people to see a part of veganism that could make them think. But I think if you're just passively being vegan, I don't think that's activism.
Yeah, I think it's possible to be passively vegan.
Yeah.
And so in that way, it's really important in conversations like this to define the word, so activism would have to be defined. We aren't saying you have to burn down a slaughterhouse.
Yeah.
Like T said,
we're not saying you shouldn't or that you should.
You can decide, but we are saying you can be active in many ways. So you can be an activist blogging recipes, and you can be an activist doing what we just said you shouldn't do.
To me, if I had to spur of the moment define activism, it would be actively engaging in activities within your means, abilities, and conscious choice to attempt to influence someone else. That to me is activism. Doing something that you are able to and that you want to and that you are deciding to help someone change.
Yeah. But you can consider yourself a vegan and not be an activist.
Yes. And aside from the kind of ableist undertones, I do think that also, again, not to be apologetic or to water things down, but we could be putting people off, new vegans in particular. I know a lot of people who have gone vegan and for the first while weren't confident to be active. Firstly, you've got to build up knowledge to be an activist. You're going to get resistance. You're going to get questions. You can't just go out there and be an activist necessarily in the way that you want. You might be a very outgoing, extroverted person, but if you just go onto the streets and start talking about veganism and you don't know what you're talking about and you don't have the answers to the common questions, you're going to bum out and you're probably going to get burnt out because you're just going to get destroyed by questions that you don't know how to answer. Like for some people, it's a completely new way of life for them. And then to tell them that they have to be active as well immediately just seems a bit ridiculous to me.
So I think we can agree that watering down the definition of veganism is a problem. You should listen to the last episode if you want to hear why we think that. But also making it too strict is a problem because it's a sure way to burn out. If you are putting all of this stuff on yourself, I have to be an activist, I can't have palm oil, I have to take a liberation pledge, I can't sit with people who I love and eat with them, you're going to explode.
Yeah.
So I think we can agree that being vegan means trying your best not to exploit animals, human and non-human.
And I think that there are a lot of shoulds that go along with that. Like you should try to always be growing and expanding the way you see the world and expanding your circle of consideration and compassion. But you don't have to be vegan.
Yeah. You should be a feminist. You should be against racism. But you don't have to be vegan.
So I think, all in all, we probably could have done this in one line and just said, the definition of veganism is fine as it is.
Sorry for wasting your time.
Yeah, so I think the definition as it stands is all it needs to be.
Yeah, and I think you should include humans, personally.
Okay, but we went through this.
Yeah.
Defining it to include humans means a whole range of things.
Yes, I know, but we should try.
So you should, you don't have to, but you should just try, just don't be shit.
Yeah, just don't be a dick, right?
Yeah, basically, that's like our life motto, just don't be a dick.
Cool, so thanks for listening to this episode.
Let us know what you think. Let us know if you think the definition is fine as it is, or if you think it should change, or if we left out anything important.
Or if you hate us and you want to correct everything we said.
Or not even correct us, just tell us how much you hate us.
Yeah,
that would be entertaining as well.
People haven't been sending any pictures of their dogs. And
from episode 1.
I know.
We asked them from episode 1. If you don't have a question, just send a picture of your dog. I think we got 2 pictures.
Yeah, or even 1. I don't know. But send us pictures of your dog.
Or your cat, or your cow, or your pig.
Yeah.
Or animals that are not living with you and are not your direct companions. That is not human, because we don't really want human pictures.
No.
We're a bit speciesist like that.
There are enough, almost 8 billion already. So.
Yeah, we can see them anywhere and anytime.
But if you have
but
if you have anything to send us, let's rage together podcast@gmail.com. You can also go to our website, let'sragetogether.co.za. That has our email address, our Patreon and PayPal links, our social media links. So yeah, thank you for listening. And tell us if you've listened, because it's really cool sometimes to hear, hey, I listened to your podcast.
Yeah, some random people that we never thought would listen, sometimes are like, oh, I listened to your last episode, and it's really surprising. So we love hearing that.
Yeah, please get in touch.
Till next time.
Love and liberation.
Cows give birth, they calves are separated. Factory workers are either scared or they're jaded. The leather industry is tied to the meat industry. Inextricably, they both responsible for misery. A non-meat diet can slow the process of aging. Avoid toxic food, contaminants, and enslavement. Reduce global warming and end world hunger. So think about it next time you sit down for supper.